Okay, hello everybody. I'm back for the St. Paul and Stylometrics lecture series. This is episode 3, where we're going to be talking about the disputed Pauline letters. Hopefully this microphone's a little bit better. Maybe I'll re-record the previous 2 episodes, but probably just leave them up. So, we've already talked about what stylometrics is, and we talked about how it's been applied, I would say successfully, in the Federalist Papers by 2 researchers where they looked at specific discriminating words that could indicate a higher probability of authorship between Madison and Hamilton. So where does this come into play for the Pauline corpus, which is the subject of this series? Well, there's a large debate about whether or not Paul actually wrote all of the 13 or 14, if you include Hebrews, letters that are historically attributed to him. And one of the factors that is used to describe whether a letter is authentic or inauthentic is the style of writing. So whether all of the New Testament texts were authentic or not goes back to the beginning of Christianity. So you can see here from the United States Council of Catholic Bishops, USCCB, there's this entry describing the letter to the Hebrews, where it began to get accepted as authentic and canonical, in air quotes, canonical, because that obviously differed around the world, in Egypt at the end of the 2nd century. And it began to be accepted in the East, but it really was contested in the West until the 4th century. So it's being contested is evidence that people were not certain Paul actually wrote this letter. We don't have good writings attributing it to him until we get to Origen's Instructor, which is recorded through the writings of Origen. If we fast forward another 1,000 years to the Reformation, we can see that the New Testament texts, Paul's letters, and other epistles are being examined through the eyes, the hermeneutical lens of the Reformers. So here I have a quote from Benjamin White in his book, Remembering Paul, where he talks about how justification by faith alone was really the perspective of the gospel. So the gospel was re-examined through the lens of this primary message, that justification is by faith alone, really coming in full force from a lot of the reformers, but Luther in particular. And here I have a screenshot from the Springfielder, Luther in the Scriptures, and it's a quote from Luther, and he says, quote, "St. James' epistle is really an epistle of straw compared to them," referencing St. John's Gospel, St. Paul's epistles, and to Luther, Romans, Galatians, and Ephesians were the main Pauline letters. So we already see here the reformers are singling out specific letters as being core teachings of Paul's message, and they're creating a hierarchy in the Scriptures about what they view as more important letters or less important letters based on this idea of justification by faith alone and other principles. Fast forward 30 years, we get to the Council of Trent in 1545, and in the 4th session, the Catholic Church reiterated the historically accepted canon, at least from the 4th century, that all of the letters of Paul that are historically attributed to him, including Hebrews, is written by Paul. So here we see the 14 epistles of Paul the Apostle, Romans, Corinthians, both letters, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians, Timothy, Titus, Philemon, and Hebrews. So the Catholic Church is now saying, no, all of these letters are Pauline, and it includes, obviously, the other epistles that are non-Pauline that came into question as being maybe less significant or less representative of their perspective of the true gospel. Fast forward now another 300 years into the 1800s, and there is this idea primarily coming out of the German church that there are central letters, and it's not Romans, Galatians, Ephesians, but it's the Hauptbrief, which is Romans, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. These are the core letters of Paul to these German scholars heading into the 1800s, and this idea gains a lot of steam, that the core message of Paul can be encapsulated through Romans, Galatians, and 1st and 2nd Corinthians theologically, but also stylistically. And so from this standard, these 4 letters formed the standard Pauline corpus. in the eyes of these 18th century scholars and church leaders, and anything that deviated significantly from their interpretation of these four letters or measurements of these four letters was deemed less authentic or potentially inauthentic. Now into the modern period. Here's a quote from Bart Ehrman's Forged from 2011. And here he discusses how almost all scholars think that there are 7 letters that are authentic of Paul. These are sometimes called the undisputed letters of Paul, just indicating that there's a large consensus around their authenticity. So he says virtually all scholars agree that 7 of the Pauline letters are authentic: Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Philippians, 1st Thessalonians, and Philemon. These 7 cohere well together and appear stylistically, theologically, and in most every other way to be by the same person. So we have the Hoptabrief still. We have Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and Galatians, but there are 3 additional letters added on to the Hoptabrief. And you can see that part of the justification that scholars are using is the style of these letters. There is the theological component present, obviously, but there is the stylometric consideration, which is part of the argument that other letters stylistically seem to diverge from these 7 central letters. So that's a quick overview just to describe how there are 13 or 14 letters of Paul, depending if you count Hebrews or not. Throughout history, the authentic corpus has been debated, even within the church. And in the Reformation, theological influences began to move the canon into a hierarchical fashion of these letters are better representations of the true gospel, these letters are less important. Catholic Church goes in, counters that idea by saying all 14 letters are written by Paul, authentic and good for teaching. And then we get into the 1800s, the Hoptabrief, 4 core letters of Paul are presented. And now in the modern period, there are 7 so-called undisputed letters of Paul that scholars agree on that are authentic. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about where exactly does stylometry come into play. We already said, Bart Ehrman brought up how style is one of the considerations for the authentic letters. And so we'll actually dig into the arguments there. What arguments are presented by scholars for saying that certain letters are authentic, certain letters are not authentic. And then after that, we'll finally be done laying the groundwork, and we'll get into a literature review from the past 10 years of studies that have looked at this issue.